Karen thought she could pour cement into my creek and no one would stop her. But when her basement turned into an underwater zoo filled with angry trout, she realized too late that nature and karma have their own ways of getting even. I moved into the quiet mountain neighborhood of Whispering Pines 2 years ago with one goal: peace. After decades in the city traffic, sirens, cramped apartments, I wanted land, fresh air, and space that felt like mine. I bought 5 acres at the edge of the development, surrounded by trees, wildlife, and best of all, a natural freshwater creek that cut right through my property. It was like having a living, breathing piece of the earth just outside my window. The water was crystal clear. Sometimes I'd sit out on the porch with a cup of coffee and watch deer drink from it, or fish darting beneath the surface. It wasn't just pretty, it was alive. It was part of what drew me to this land in the first place. Whispering Pines came with one small annoyance: the homeowners association. I had read the bylaws, nothing too crazy. Maintain the lawn, no loud parties, no livestock. Fine, I could deal with that. What I didn't realize until later was that the real rulebook belonged to Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood. Her actual title was HOA president, but she acted more like a mayor with a personal army of rule enforcers. Tall, stiff, always in khakis and a perfectly pressed polo shirt. Karen had this way of looking at you like she already knew you were doing something wrong. The first time we met, she showed up at my front door with a clipboard and a disapproving glance. "You're the new owner of Lot 47, she asked, squinting at me like I was a roach on her floor. "That's me," I said, trying to be friendly. "I'm Mason, nice to meet you." She didn't shake my hand. "I noticed your shed is brown. Neutral earth tones are encouraged in the HOA guidelines, but we typically recommend slate gray or forest green to keep the neighborhood cohesive." "It came with the property," I replied, "but I can repaint it." She scribbled something down on her clipboard. "Please do. And also, I noticed that you've got some wild grass near the creek. You might want to mow that down, it attracts mosquitoes." "It's not wild grass," I explained. "That's native vegetation. It keeps the creek bank from eroding." Karen pursed her lips. "Well, erosion or not, standing water isn't good for anyone. Just make sure it stays neat. This isn't the wilderness." I should have known right then that this wasn't the last I'd hear about my creek. Over the next few months, I made my place a home. I kept to myself, mostly cleared trails in the woods. Built a garden near the porch, set up a bench by the creek where I could sit and read. It was exactly the life I wanted. Occasionally, I'd see Karen patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart, stopping to measure someone's mailbox height, or taking photos of a flag that didn't align with HOA standards. But I avoided drama. I paid my dues, I followed the rules, and I kept things quiet. One afternoon, I was working on building a small footbridge across the narrowest part of the creek. Nothing major, just a few planks supported by stones on either side. While I worked, I heard footsteps behind me. Turning around, I saw Karen standing there, arms crossed, looking down at the water with a sour expression. "That's going to be a problem," she said. I paused. "What is?" "The creek, it's creating a drainage issue. We've had reports of mosquitoes and kids walking too close to the edge. It's a safety hazard." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "The creek isn't on HOA property. It's on my land." Karen didn't flinch. "Land doesn't excuse liability. We need to think about the greater good of the neighborhood. This eyesore has to be dealt with. We've decided it would be best to fill it in." My jaw hung open. "You've decided?" She nodded. "The board will approve it. It's just a matter of paperwork. We'll send in a crew to pour concrete, smooth it over, and turn it into a walking path or maybe a small garden. Much better use of the space." I laughed, literally laughed out loud. "Karen, that's a protected creek. It's a natural water source. You can't just fill it in like a pothole." She didn't blink. "We've handled water issues before. It's not a drainage ditch. It's a living ecosystem. Fish, frogs, turtles, this is part of the watershed." Karen turned to go, but not before tossing a final remark over her shoulder. "Don't worry, we'll make it look nice." I watched her walk away, heart pounding with disbelief. I thought about calling the HOA office right then and there too, to file a complaint, but something told me this wasn't the kind of battle that would be won with phone calls. I needed to be prepared. That night I dug out my deedland survey and any legal documentation I had about the creek. Sure enough, the creek was well within my property lines. Better yet, it was listed in the county's watershed preservation records as part of the Oak River tributary system, meaning it was protected under state environmental laws. That gave me some relief. At least on paper, I had the law on my side. But when it came to Karen, paperwork meant nothing. She didn't operate on facts. She operated on control. About a week later it happened. I was inside reading when I heard a low rumble. It sounded like construction equipment. I ran to the porch and saw 2 large cement trucks pulling into the lower edge of my land, right near the creek bed. A third truck was unloading large cement pipes. Workers in vests and hard hats stepped out and began setting up barriers. I sprinted down the hill, heart in my throat. Stout, what are you doing? I shouted. One of the men turned around surprised. We're here to start filling this in. HOA orders said it was a public hazard. It's not public, I said. This is private land, mine. A voice behind me cut through the moment. Not for long. I spun around. Karen was standing behind the fence, clipboard in hand, looking pleased with herself. You can't do this, I yelled. This is a violation of state law, she shrugged. Then call the state. I already was. I pulled out my phone and began filming everything: the trucks, the workers, the pipes, and Karen's smug expression. You're being recorded, I said. Good, she replied. We're cleaning up a nuisance. I didn't argue anymore. I called the county sheriff, the Department of Environmental Protection, the HOA board, and even my lawyer. By the time the sheriff showed up, half the creek bed was covered in cement. Fish flopped on the banks. The workers backed off when the deputy asked to see a permit, which, of course, they didn't have. Karen suddenly became quiet, claiming it was a misunderstanding and temporary work. But the damage was already done. The cement had blocked the flow of the creek. Water pooled upstream, flooding part of my trail and threatening my garden. The wildlife was gone. My peaceful sanctuary had been turned into a broken mess. And as I stood there, boots soaked, jaw clenched, I realized something. Karen had declared war, but she had no idea what she had started or what would come flooding back into her life. For the first time since moving to Whispering Pines, I felt like a stranger on my own land. The sounds that once comforted me, birds chirping, water flowing gently through the rocks, were gone. The creek that used to snake quietly through my backyard now stood choked and lifeless under a suffocating layer of gray concrete. It wasn't just about the view anymore. This place had been part of something living, something sacred. Karen hadn't just destroyed a patch of ground, she had violated nature, and I wasn't going to let that slide. I spent the next few days gathering everything I could: photos, videos, legal documents, witness accounts. I met with a local environmental consultant named Russell, who took one look at the damage and muttered, "Oh boy, they messed up big time." He explained that my creek, being part of the Oak River tributary system, fell under the state's protected waterway list. Any disturbance, especially pouring cement, was considered a felony-level environmental violation. That meant fines, restoration costs, even potential criminal charges. That was the good news. The bad news: the process to pursue those charges wasn't immediate. The state had to conduct its own investigation. They sent out a team within a week, and those inspectors didn't hide their horror when they saw the half-concreted creek bed. The lead investigator, a tall, no-nonsense woman named Marsha Dean, took measurements, collected water samples, and shook her head the entire time. Whoever did this, she said, is in for a very rude awakening. I nodded. Her name is Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Gave the orders without a permit, without consent, and lied about the land being public. Marsha scribbled in her notepad, "We'll handle it." Still, while I waited on the state to act, I had to live with the consequences. The water had no natural outlet anymore. Rain came, heavy mountain rain, as it often did this time of year, and it had nowhere to go. The dam of cement crew had poured held back more than just water. It trapped runoff from uphill, blocked the underground flow, and slowly started flooding the area behind my garden. It turned soft soil into mud. The trees near the bank began to lean. I tried to redirect the water myself using pipes and trenches, but it wasn't enough. This was bigger than a DIY fix. Meanwhile, Karen carried on like nothing happened. She drove around in her white SUV, clipboard in hand, nodding at flower beds and garbage bins like she was inspecting a parade float. Every time she passed my house, she looked the other way, avoiding eye contact. But I caught her one day, early in the morning, standing at the edge of her backyard. Her property bordered mine on the east side, and staring at the now stagnant creek. I watched her from behind my curtain. She looked ... concerned, nervous even. Her perfect hair was slightly frizzed, her lips pressed into a tight line as she surveyed the damage. That's when the first complaint came in. It wasn't from MIT, it was from her. She filed an official HOA report saying that my flooded land was now causing moisture seepage into the foundation of her home. The irony was so thick I nearly choked when I read the letter. She claimed I had neglected proper water management and demanded I repair and remove excess flooding immediately. I laughed and got to work. My reply wasn't a letter. It was a formal countercomplaint, including a full packet of documents, timestamps of her unauthorized cement job, drone footage of her crew on my land, photos of the damage, and a letter from the state's environmental team confirming that the creek was under protection and had been illegally altered. 3 days later, she received her first official notice from the county. I saw the envelope delivered to her door, a bold red seal stamped on the front. She opened it right there, on her porch. Her expression changed from smug to stunned in seconds. She stormed back inside, slamming the door behind her so hard I felt the vibration from my porch. That same evening the rains came again, this time heavier than before. Thunder rolled over the mountaintops. Sheets of rain hammered the ground. My land, despite the backup, was slightly uphill, but Karen's home sat on the slope, and gravity never picked sides. The water, now blocked and redirected by the concrete barrier, began pushing its way east toward her property. The next morning, I got a knock on my door. It wasn't Karen, it was one of the neighborhood kids, Timmy, from across the street. He was soaked, breathing hard. "Mr. Mason," he said, "Miss Karen's house has water in it. The basement's flooded." I grabbed my raincoat and followed him. I didn't expect what I saw. Karen's front yard was covered in puddles, her flower beds drowned, and mud was sliding down the slight hill behind her house. But it was the basement windows that told the real story. Murky water had filled them halfway up. Inside you could see floating bins, ruined furniture, and most bizarrely something moving. I stepped closer. Fish. There were actual fish swimming in Karen's basement, somehow trapped from the initial creek block and swept up in the rain surge. A group of trout had been carried into the pool floodwater. Her basement had literally turned into a fish tank. I couldn't help it. I pulled out my phone and filmed it, not to mock her, but to document how far this mess had gone. This was no longer about property rights. This was an environmental and structural disaster. Karen came out of the house a moment later, soaked to the knees, holding a mop that had clearly lost its battle hours ago. She saw me filming and snapped, "Are you enjoying this?" I lowered the phone. "No, but maybe now you understand why that creek mattered." She didn't respond. Her lips trembled, not with sadness but with fury. She was the kind of person who had never been challenged, never been told no, and had it stick. Now, she wasn't just losing control, she was sinking with it. That night, emergency crews arrived to assess the damage. A local news station even did a short segment on it. They interviewed Marsha from the environmental office, who very calmly explained how illegal interference with waterways can have unpredictable and often catastrophic consequences. They didn't name Karen, but everyone in the neighborhood knew who was behind it. The whispers spread fast. By the end of the week, the state issued a formal cease and desist to the HOA. All construction and interference with the creek were to stop immediately. Karen was also served with a personal fine, 5 figures, and informed that she could face civil liability for all restoration costs. Her face, usually tight and proud, now looked pale and hollow when I saw her next. She didn't wave, she didn't glare. She just walked quickly to a car and drove off. And the creek, it was still clogged. But the state now had a plan in place. Over the coming months, they'd bring in a specialized team to break apart the concrete, restore the natural bank, and help bring the ecosystem back to life. It would be slow, it would be expensive, but nature has a way of healing, especially when people finally get out of the way. For now, I kept the sign I made posted at the edge of the property, a simple wooden plank that read, "This creek doesn't belong to you, it belongs to the earth. Respect it." The neighborhood had changed. People walked slower past my yard now, curious, cautious, no longer blindly following Karen's rules. Maybe the fish in her basement had been a wake-up call, or maybe, just maybe, they were calmer with gills. Either way, the water was done being silent. The whispers started small. At first, it was just a few neighbors mumbling under their breath during HOA meetings. A quiet murmur about Karen's fish tank, or a joke slipped between sips of lemonade at someone's backyard BBQ. But in Whispering Pines, word traveled fast. It didn't take long before the entire neighborhood knew about Karen's basement flooding, the illegal cement job, and the trout that had made themselves at home below her living room. People stopped looking at her like she was the queen of the neighborhood. They started looking at her like she was a cautionary tale, and Karen felt it. She stopped her daily patrols. No more golf carts slowly rolling through the streets like she was the sheriff in some HOA Wild West. She cancelled the next board meeting for health reasons, though everyone suspected it was more like shame. And when she did venture out, her once ever-present clipboard was nowhere to be seen. Instead, she walked briskly, head down, as if hoping no one would recognize her without the badge of authority she used to carry so proudly. But the cracks in Karen's world weren't just social, they were literal. The flooding hadn't just affected the basement. Her home sat on a slightly sloped section of land, and the pressure from the rerouted water, thanks to her own cement damming, had shifted the soil beneath her foundation. One evening, I noticed a crew of surveyors outside her house, walking the perimeter with measuring tools and worried expressions. The next day, workers showed up with equipment and began drilling small test holes in the yard. Word was that her entire foundation had shifted nearly 4 inches in one corner. That's the kind of shift that ruins a house from the inside out. Still, Karen wouldn't admit defeat. Not publicly. Not yet. She tried to play it off like it was a minor issue. Just preventative work, she told a neighbor who asked. Nothing serious. But that same week, she filed a request to the HOA board to tap into emergency neighborhood funds for flood-related damages. The irony of her using HOA funds to clean up a mess she caused was almost too much. Several residents and longtime board members pushed back, questioning whether she even had the right to remain president after what happened. That's when Karen made her next mistake. She doubled down. Rather than laying low and letting the mess fade from memory, she went on the offensive. A week later, every resident in the neighborhood received a thick envelope in the mail. Inside was a formal letter from the HOA signed by Karen herself, announcing a proposed amendment to the HOA bylaws. The amendment would grant the HOA temporary access and control over adjacent water sources or environmental features deemed potentially hazardous or visually disruptive. In short, she was trying to give herself legal control over everyone's water features, ponds, creeks, even decorative fountains. The backlash was instant. At the next emergency meeting, over 70 residents showed up 3 times more than usual. The community center was packed, standing room only. Karen stood at the front of the room, trying to maintain her composure. But the crowd was not on her side. "I'm sorry," one elderly man said loudly. "You're asking us to let you manage our yards when you can't even manage your own." Housewoman raised her hand. "Are you going to fill my koi pond with cement next?" Another neighbor added, "Why are we footing the bill for your busted basement?" Karen tried to respond, claiming she was just trying to prevent future issues, but no one was buying it anymore. The trust was gone. The fear was gone. The room wasn't just annoyed, it was angry. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't go in swinging. I walked to the front, holding a stack of documents, the environmental violation reports, the cease and desist order, the repair estimate from the state, and placed them on the table beside her. "These are the facts," I said, calmly. "This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a decision made by one person, on someone else's land, without consent, without permits, and without respect for the law or the environment. That decision destroyed a protected creek, caused flooding across properties, and cost this community thousands. Don't get to pretend it didn't happen." Silence. Karen stared at me with hollow eyes, but for once, she didn't argue. By the end of the meeting, the proposed amendment was voted down unanimously. More than that, several members of the community filed a motion to hold a vote of no confidence against Karen's leadership. She still had allies, 1 or 2, but even they looked uneasy, like rats on a sinking ship, and the ship was sinking fast. 2 days later, the environmental restoration crew finally arrived. State workers in boots and gloves began the slow process of removing the cement from my creek. It wasn't easy. Cement doesn't just lift off like a top. It had to be broken up piece by piece, using specialized tools that wouldn't damage the remaining soil and water channels. I watched them work for hours, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. What Karen had destroyed in one morning would take months to undo, but healing had begun. As the workers made progress, something miraculous happened. Water returned. Slowly, at first a trickle here, a small stream there, but as the blockage cleared, the creek started to breathe again. I remember the moment it happened, standing near the edge, boots in the mud, when the water finally surged forward again and spilled over the rocks like it had before. Birds returned. I even saw a heron that afternoon, standing motionless in the SHALLOWS. Nature was coming back. That night I went down to the creek with a flashlight. I wasn't expecting to see much, but there, near one of the deeper pools, I caught a glimpse of silver movement. Fish. Real, live fish. Somehow they had survived, trapped in the upper pools, hiding in the muddy eddies, waiting. They were survivors, like the land itself. The next day I installed a new wooden bench along the trail I'd cleared. Facing the water, I carved 3 words into the backrest: "Let it flow." Meanwhile, Karen's life continued unraveling, with the HOA presidency hanging by a thread, and her house being evaluated for foundation failure. She disappeared from public life. A for sale sign went up in her yard, though I doubted anyone would bite. The neighborhood had moved on. The fear of her clipboard and rules had vanished. Parents let their kids ride bikes on the sidewalk again. Someone even repainted their house bright blue. No one came around to measure it. But what stuck with me most wasn't the damage, or even the fish in her basement. It was the way she reacted when everything crumbled. She never apologized, not once, not to me, not to the neighbors, not to the state. She just kept pretending, right up until the final board meeting, when she was officially voted out. Her last act as president, she didn't show up. Someone else had to pack her things from the HOA office and change the locks. Her reign was over, not with a fight, but with silence. And me, I went back to living my life, slowly, steadily, peacefully. The creek now flowed freely, its voice soft but strong. I planted trees along the banks to hold the soil and attract birds. One added a few stones near the footbridge, the one I never finished. Maybe someday I'd rebuild it, maybe not. I didn't need to control the land, I just needed to respect it, and every now and then I'd sit on that bench, sip my coffee, and listen to the water, let it flow. Autumn arrived in whispering pines with a quiet kind of beauty. The trees turned golden, the wind grew crisp, and the creek, now fully revived, shimmered with life as it weaved gently through my land like a ribbon of silver. The summer chaos felt like a distant storm, one that had passed, but not without leaving wreckage in its wake. Karen Whitmore's reign, as the neighbors had started calling it, was officially over. After her vote of no confidence, the HOA elected a new president, a soft-spoken retired fire chief named George Lambert. George had lived in the neighborhood for 15 years, always kept his lawn neat, waved at everyone, and most importantly minded his own business. The entire community seemed to exhale the moment he took over. No more surprise citations, no more notes on doors, no more self-righteous power plays. George believed in fairness, in communication, and in letting people live. Karen, on the other hand, had vanished from public view entirely. Her house, once immaculately maintained, began to show signs of neglect. The shutters faded, the garden turned brown, and weeds crept into the walkway. The white SUV that had once patrolled the neighborhood like a watchtower sat unmoved in the driveway. Rumor had it she was trying to sell the place quietly, avoiding a formal listing to dodge questions. But in a town this small, word spreads faster than truth can hide. Everyone knew the story. No one wanted to buy a house with a basement that had become a temporary trout exhibit one morning. I was working in my garden when George stopped by. "Mind if I come down to the creek?" he asked, wiping his brow under a ball cap that said, "Whispering Pines Volunteer Fire Department." "Of course," I said, setting down my shovel. "Come take a look." We walked the short trail that led to the newly restored waterway. The state's environmental crew had done a remarkable job. The rocks were back in place. Native plants had been replanted along the banks, and the water ran clear and smooth. There were even new signs posted. "Protected waterway, do not disturb." George stared at the creek, hands on his hips, then gave a slow nod. "Beautiful work. You fought hard for this." I shrugged. "I just didn't want it destroyed." "No," George said. "You stood up to a bully. That takes more guts than most folks have." We stood in silence for a while, listening to a soft trickle of water. Then George cleared his throat. "There's something you should know," he said. "Karen ... Well, she's being sued. Civil suit. From the State Environmental Office." My eyes widened slightly. "For the creek damage." "Yup. And for misappropriation of HOA funds, too. She authorized those cement trucks with HOA money, filed it under land improvement, then told the board it was for trail work. Turns out she faked invoices and got a private contract to her cousin." I think I exhaled slowly. "So it wasn't just about control. She profited off it." "Looks that way." "The county's going after her." Hard. It was strange. As much as I disliked her, I couldn't help but feel a sliver of pity. Not sympathy, but a small, quiet recognition of how much a person can unravel when they cling to control too tightly. Karen had built her life around authority, around dominance, and when that power crumbled, so did she. Later that week I got a knock on my door. I opened it to find someone I didn't expect: Karen's husband, Doug. He was rarely seen around the neighborhood, a quiet man who'd always let Karen do the talking. He stood awkwardly, holding a small cardboard box in both hands. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked. "Sure," I said cautiously, stepping out onto the porch. Doug looked thinner than I remembered. His eyes had heavy bags beneath them, and his voice was tired in a way that didn't come from work. "She's leaving," he said plainly. "Karen?" He nodded. "She's moving in with her sister out in Arizona. We ... Well, we're separating." I wasn't sure what to say. "She wanted me to give you this," he added, holding out the box. I didn't take it right away. "What is it?" "Records, HOA files, notes, emails, copies of permits, everything from the last few years. She said she doesn't want them anymore. Figured you might need them if the investigation goes further." I hesitated, then accepted the box. "Thanks." Doug turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, I told her not to touch the creek. Told her it was a bad idea. But she didn't listen to anyone. Not me, not the board, not the neighborhood." "I believe you," I said quietly. He nodded and walked back to his truck. I stood there for a moment, holding the box, feeling the weight of it not just physically, but symbolically. Karen's grip had finally been pried loose. And now, all that was left were papers, mistakes, and silence. That night, I sat at my dining table and opened the box. Inside were meticulously labeled folders, divided by year. Her handwriting was neat, precise, almost obsessive. I found HOA budgets, diagrams of the neighborhood, permit applications, most of them real. But toward the bottom, things got darker. There were letters she never sent, threats drafted against neighbors for infractions like improper trash bin placement and unauthorized wind chimes. One folder was labeled Creek Private Actions. I opened it slowly. Inside were maps of my property, printed satellite photos, notes about project, cement, and a budget breakdown that included materials, labor, and transportation. She had planned it weeks in advance. There was even an unsigned letter she had typed intended for me that said, "Your lack of cooperation has forced the board to take necessary action. This neighborhood will not be held hostage by your personal preferences." I stared at those words for a long time. It wasn't about mosquitoes, or children's safety, or community standards. It was about control. Pure and simple. By the following week, Karen was gone. A moving truck came in the early morning, and by noon, the house was empty. The for sale sign came down. The windows were shuttered. Just like that, she vanished from Whispering Pines without a single goodbye, but her shadow still lingered. The new HOA board, now led by George, spent weeks going through her files. They reversed several fines she'd issued, refunded residents for unnecessary citations, and rewrote large parts of the bylaws to prevent another power grab. I even got a formal apology letter signed by every board member. It didn't erase what happened, but it helped. Meanwhile, life settled into a new rhythm. Neighbors who once kept their heads down now waved when they passed. We had our first neighborhood BBQ in years, no inspections, no rules, just laughter and grilled burgers. I brought fresh trout from the creek, and people laughed when I joked about Karen's basement fish spa. The water kept flowing, the trees shed their leaves, the air grew colder. One morning I stood by the creek and watched as fog curled along the surface like smoke. The fish were still there, darting in the cold water. Birds called from the trees. It felt whole again. Yet, I knew something now, something I hadn't fully understood before. Karen's downfall. Control is a tricky thing. We chase it because we think it protects us, that it keeps the chaos out, but the more we try to grip it, the more damage we do to ourselves and to the world around us. Karen tried to own the creek, tame it, silence it, but water doesn't work that way. It finds cracks, it rises, it moves, it carves stone with time and floods those who try to cage it. Standing there, I realized I hadn't just won back my land, I had learned the most important truth about it. You don't own the land, you belong to it, and the creek, after everything it had endured, still sang its song. Softer now, wiser, but unstoppable, just like the truth. The week after the government issued restoration orders, things began to spiral out of Karen's control. At first, she tried to act unbothered, brushing off the citations and court summons as just misunderstandings. She even called an emergency HOA meeting, standing in front of the community like a wannabe martyr. "This is a smear campaign," she declared, waving the environmental notice like a cheap prop. "He's exaggerating everything. I was only trying to beautify our neighborhood, keep us safe." But the neighbors weren't buying it anymore. Her reputation had taken too many hits. First, they saw the construction trucks dumping cement on land that clearly wasn't HOA property. Then came the footage I had uploaded online, clear as daylight, showing her supervising the entire operation. When the environmental agents showed up in hazmat suits and water testing kits, even the few loyal board members she had left started distancing themselves. Now her home was sinking, her foundation cracked, and a musty, damp smell hung over her lawn like a warning sign. And the worst part, nature wasn't finished with her yet. Rain returned in full force. It didn't drizzle, it poured. Days of steady storms battered the valley, soaking the clay-rich soil and testing every weak foundation in the neighborhood. But none were weaker than Karen's. The ground beneath her house had already been compromised. With the creek cemented over, the water had no natural path to flow. It pooled, then pressed against her foundation like an invisible fist waiting to strike. One night, around 3 a.m., the earth finally gave in. Neighbors described a loud rumble followed by what sounded like a muffled explosion. Karen's backyard collapsed in on itself. A 6-foot-wide sinkhole opened under her patio and swallowed half of it whole. The retaining wall she'd installed last year tipped into the hole like a toy. Water surged into the crater like it had been waiting for the moment. The beautiful trout creek she'd tried to erase came roaring back, this time with vengeance. The water rushed underneath her house, splitting her already weak basement slab in half. The next morning she awoke to a horrific sight. Actual live fish swimming in her living room. Carp, minnows, and a few lost crawfish, dragged from the underground spring now bubbling freely beneath her home. The concrete she had used to choke the creek had fractured from below. Broken slabs of it had been shoved upward into her floor tiles, turning her house into a bizarre blend of urban and aquatic. She called the police. They couldn't help. She called animal control. They couldn't help either. Then she tried the insurance company, only to be told that since the flooding was caused by an unpermitted alteration to a protected waterway, her policy wouldn't cover it. I stood by the roadside as she watched her yard collapse. For a moment I felt sorry for her, not because she didn't deserve the outcome, she absolutely did, but because she had done it to herself. She thought she could control nature. She thought her authority as HOA president meant she could bend the land, the law, and the people to her will. But nature doesn't play politics. A few days later, state officials from the Department of Natural Resources arrived with court enforcement orders. Not only would Karen be responsible for paying restoration fees, but she was being sued for damages by the state, by the county, and by me personally. Her face went pale when she was handed the papers. "This can't be real." She kept whispering I was trying to help. The courts didn't care about her intentions. They cared about the consequences. The judge ruled that she had acted with gross negligence. She would be forced to pay hundreds of thousands in repair costs, legal fees, and fines. Her assets were frozen pending further investigation. Her HOA leadership status was revoked immediately, and the entire board was disbanded under court supervision until a new one could be elected. Meanwhile, restoration crews worked tirelessly to save what was left of the creek. They had to chip away at the dried cement using small tools to avoid disturbing the sensitive ecosystem further. Biologists came and reintroduced native fish. They planted trees, installed drainage swales, and rebuilt the natural bank that Karen had destroyed. By the end of the month, the water flowed freely again, cool, clean, and alive. As for Karen, she moved out of the neighborhood, or rather, she was forced to. With her house condemned and legal bills piling up, she sold what little furniture she had left and quietly disappeared. Rumor had it she moved in with her sister in another state, but no one really cared where she went. In the eyes of the community, she had burned every bridge and buried herself in her own mess. A few months later, the HOA held a new election. This time, the bylaws were rewritten to include stronger checks on authority, mandatory land surveys before any work could be approved, and a clause that required every single board action to be publicly recorded. And guess who they voted in as a new board advisor? Me. I wasn't power hungry. I didn't want control. I just wanted to make sure no one ever tried to bury nature under bureaucracy again. My first act was to install a sign by the creek. It read, "Respect the land, or the land will remind you," and right below that, in small letters, "Property of Bright Creek Preserve." The same preserve Karen had tried to erase was now a protected landmark, sponsored in part by the county and managed by volunteers, many of whom used to be Karen's biggest supporters. Funny how nature can humble even the loudest voices. I still sit by the creek sometimes. The sound of the flowing water is louder now, almost as if it's reclaiming its place with pride. I see deer returning, birds nesting, frogs singing at night. The ecosystem is healing, and so is the community. People walk by with their kids, point to the fish, and tell the story of the lady who tried to destroy a creek and ended up living in a fish tank. It's not just a tale of revenge. It's a reminder that when people act out of arrogance and control, there will always be consequences, especially when they mess with Mother Nature. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube for more true stories that strike hard. We bring you drama, justice, and unforgettable twists every week.